Welcome to episode 203 of the Actual Astronomy Podcast. I'm Chris, and joining me is Shane. We are amateur astronomers who love looking up at the night sky, and this podcast is for anyone else who likes going out under the stars. So this podcast might seem really amateurish because I don't know that we've done one quite like this before.
No, and this one I feel like we should have touched on this topic sooner, just because of our proximity. And anyway, why don't you tell everybody what we're going to talk about today, and it'll make more sense maybe.
So we're going to talk about an astronomer, an amateur astronomer, I should say, whose name is Lucien Kemble, and he was a local amateur astronomer, belonged to the local club here near where we live. He lived just outside the city of Regina, and he also lived over in Cochrane, Alberta. And I think he did some other travels around and observed in a few different places, but those were kind of like his two main haunts. And when he lived in each of these locations, which aren't too far apart, as the crow flies here, I don't know like 600 or 700 kilometers apart, if that. Mm-hmm. He had an observatory and observed with a variety of instruments, but Kemble is most well known for Kemble's Cascade, which is a beautiful line of stars which pools down into NGC 1502, which is an open cluster. Have you ever seen Kemble's Cascade, Shane?
Oh, many times. It's beautiful, particularly with that cluster at the end of it. Probably one of my most fond observations of it was through my 120 millimeter ED refractor, just in the backyard. It's fine in light polluted areas. It looks better under a dark sky, but don't let that stop you. It's quite wide. I can't remember how wide it is. It just barely
2.5. 2.5.
Yeah. I forget the eyepiece I was using, but I was just able to get the whole cascade plus that.
Oh, your telescope. How wide field your telescope was.
Yeah. No. First of all, the object, and then I can't remember which eyepiece for the field.
Yeah.
But anyway, it was beautiful. It's a great cluster. It's a great, I guess it's an asterism, isn't it?
Yeah, so it's a group of stars that have like sort of a chance alignment, which makes it look like sort of quote unquote something, and this something here is like a stream of stars, as Kemble put it, and he wrote to Walter Scott Houston, and his observation and sketch of it were published in December of 1980, and when Houston was writing about it, he sort of gave it his own spin and his own words, and those caught on by sort of changing it from the Kemble stream, which is how Kemble had noted it in his notes, to Kemble's Cascade. And what's neat is, Shane, you and I have seen Kemble's notes, and you can actually see in his notes on NGC 1502 and Kemble's Cascade that he writes Kemble stream, and then you can tell like that's in pen or something like a different writing utensil, and then that's got 2 or 3 lines through it, and then in different in pencil it's Cascade. So he actually had taken and crossed out what he had called it and then replaced it with what Houston Jones had called it, which is super cool to see.
Yeah, very neat. So just some quick background too, like why I mentioned, we probably should have talked about Lucien at an earlier point in this life of our podcast because of our proximity. So not only did Lucien observe near like 20 minutes away from where Chris and I live, but when Lucien Kemble passed away, his observatory was donated to our local astronomy club and is still standing. It's a roll-off roof observatory, and it was moved to the club's dark site. But in addition to that, I think his entire astronomical library was donated to the local astronomy club as well. So there's some wonderful books that Lucien used or referenced that are now, part of the local club's library, but also magazines like the Deep Sky Journal. Lucien had a subscription to that. And I guess it's also the Deep Sky magazine. I think there's a couple. Yeah. Yep. So all of these were donated. They're in wonderful condition, and like some of these magazines were marked up by Lucien as well. Like The one that has the article that we're going to talk about here shortly. So this is from, what is this here? Fall of 1987. It's the Deep Sky magazine. And within it is an article on Scudam's dazzling star cloud. And there is a list. It's a page long. There has to be, I'm going to guess, 40-ish objects, maybe a little bit more. But what's interesting is like there's pen marks beside, I would say, close to half of them, which to me indicates Lucien has observed those. And anyway, I just think that's super cool to have such a close connection to such a well-renowned astronomer. And I'm excited to talk about him today.
Yeah, so am I. And I never met him, although I was into astronomy, and I had been going to RASC meetings and subscribed to all the magazines and joined some early online forums by that time. And he was online, and I remember going in and reading some of his reports, and I was like, if anybody was really into astronomy almost anywhere in the world, I didn't live anywhere near here at that time. You kind of knew who the people were that were kind of sort of pushing back, the veil of the night sky and really trying to plumb the depths, and he was one of those people. And there was a small number of them who were basically trying to look at everything. And by going through his notes, and like you were saying, Shane, he was really trying to systematically go through the entire night sky. And we've been fortunate to get to know another one of these individuals that was sort of working in a way alongside Kemble, who is Mark Bratton, who also lives here and has an observatory. And we've been fortunate to observe with him many times. And these are dedicated deep sky observers on, my opinion, just a completely different level. I feel like, for me anyway, I feel like an amateur astronomer. I really love doing it and that, but the dedication that some of these people have taken to it, like Mark and Lucien, are just such interesting and fascinating observers that you just cherish the moments that you get to spend with them under the nighttime sky. Just truly astounding people.
Yeah, what a great way to state that, Chris. And I like that you kind of called out that it is next level. Like you and I love observing, and we observe quite a bit, I would say. But I feel like I'm nowhere near the output that like Lucien Kemble observes or did observe with, and how Mark observes. It really is astounding, what they're able or how much they're able to observe. It's quite inspiring to me.
It is, and why I say, like, I feel lucky, like these aren't just words I'm saying, it's my own experience. And I feel lucky for many of the people that I've been fortunate to observe with, but sort of like in particular, what I learned from Mark is, he put me over the edge on the sketching. So I always wanted to sketch. I always really admired people who could sketch. And I'd learned some from my friend Kathleen, my friend Randall, and a few other people like Risa. But when I observed with Mark, what he really demonstrated for me in the field was, and he did. He when I say he said, "This is how you do it," and he showed me, and I was like, "I think I got it." I think I can do this. And within a year, I was sort of down to be sketching at many of my sessions. I don't sketch at every session like people like Mark and Lucien seem to, but I sketch at like 3/4 of my sessions now, and it's really brought a lot more enjoyment. Like, here I am, somebody who's been doing this for decades, and suddenly I feel like I'm getting more enjoyment in astronomy than I ever have, and that's what I feel like people like Kemble and a lot of the other people that like you said are sort of at that next level can help bring those of us who have maybe been doing this for a long time. You can always still learn something and suddenly sort of super enhance your enjoyment of astronomy even after you've been doing it for so long. And I know sometimes people ask, you've been doing this for so long or whatever, and kind of maybe you're not still like that enthused or whatever, but I kind of feel like I'm more enthused as ever, and it's really really bugging me how we haven't been able to get out together over the past couple of months because of the weather. So anyway, with that, yeah, so you've allowed me this time, Shane, to kind of exercise my demons. So maybe I'll just say this, and that's that every year I write an article with my friend Randall for the Observer's Handbook. And Randall's been on the show before, and he's a historian and a great illustrator. And we work together on a project, and then we publish it in the RAC Observer's Handbook as sort of our feature constellation or region of the sky or whatever. So recently I was in a meeting with the observing committee, and Dale, who's on the committee with us, had sent around this article that Kemble had written in the fall, or had published in the fall of '87 on his 50 to the pole project. So I was really thrilled about this, and then you and I started chatting, Shane, and you really got me. You really kind of spurred me on, because I had some of the material, and you were able to kind of link me up with your digital copy, and it actually worked better on my machine. So anyway, I appreciate that.
Yeah, it's kind of like you had all of the digital copies from many, many years ago of Kemble's observations. Just that computer was not working so well for you, so I was able to kind of help you out. But yeah, we both have had, so I guess maybe something else I didn't mention is Kemble, as an observer, was quite diligent in recording all of his observations. He had a paper template that he would identify, date, kind of all of the pertinent information that you would have about an observation log, but he'd also sketch it, and thousands of these things, like over 3,000, I believe. So this is like a part of the information that was passed on to the local observing club when he passed away, and all of that was scanned many, many years ago. And yeah, you received a copy of all of that, and I did too. And it's kind of neat to go through that stuff and just see what he observed in his sketching, and what he thought of it in some regards. Although sometimes his the description of his observation sometimes didn't have a lot of detail in it, but the sketches are quite nice nonetheless.
Yeah, and kind of like what you were saying, he was working through this project and many other projects. Seemed like he was basically trying to observe everything in the nighttime sky, and that he could see through his 11-inch telescope and smaller instruments. And I don't know if he accomplished that goal, but he got close. I'll say that. If what I've been able to glean from his notes and in correspondence with people like Alistair Ling, who is a columnist for Astronomy magazine. He writes, I think, a large portion of the What's in the Sky each month for Astronomy magazine. But I think that what's been available digitally is only a portion of his observations. I'll get more into that later. But I'll say this as well. You actually live on the other side of the city. You actually live closer to my observing site than I do. And I think for you and for me as well, when we go to my site, we actually drive by where Kemble observed. We drive within, say, maybe less than a kilometer of where his observatory was. And because you're a little bit closer, you're probably about, or Kemble's site would have been about halfway out to my site, I think, for you.
Yeah, you're right. It is actually quite close to where I live right now.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, also back, so where Kemble lived, it's a small town just outside of our major city here in a beautiful valley. It's quite a stunning location.
It is.
The big thing, though, when Kemble was living there, our city was much, much smaller and far less light pollution. So I think the skies out there would have been quite nice, actually.
Yeah, they would. I kind of think probably, and I'm sort of twice the distance, which is still not really that far. But I'm about twice the distance now. So probably where my place is probably maybe within spitting distance of what he would have been seeing under his skies, which is sort of like a pretty decent 6th magnitude sky. It might have been a little bit better. But I think it's fairly close. But yeah, it's kind of cool. Like every time I drive by, he was a Franciscan friar, and he was at a place called St. Michael's Retreat, and that's where he had his observatory. That was just who he was. And you drive by this. It's up on a hill that you drive by. You go down to the valley and you drive by this, and then you kind of continue down the valley, and another 15 minutes or so, and that's where my place is. So it's kind of neat. So, and I often feel that, like when I'm out there observing, I'm in that same valley topography that he was in as well. I think about that frequently. So anyway, well, shall I read? It's a very brief essay I wrote, and I'm not sure what will happen to it, because I wasn't granted an additional real estate in the text this year. So I'm gonna redo what I was going to do, and I was going to include this essay as part of it, but I'm not going to do that now. So I was like, well, instead of just letting it languish or go into the trash bin, I'll read it on our podcast, and then we can discuss some of the other objects that I found on his notes that I'm interested in observing, and hopefully you will too, Shane.
Yeah, I'm excited for this. And like you said, Chris, this was intended to be published, but it may not end up being published. So this might be the only time people can be a part of it or understand the research that you did here. So yeah, okay. I'm excited.
All right. Well, thanks so much. So this is called the 50 to the Pole. Father Lucien Kemble lived from 1922 to 1999. That means this year he would have been 100. He was a Franciscan friar, and those are the guys in the long brown robes with the white rope belt. And he was among the most dedicated and productive visual observers. He was a larger-than-life personality, as Murray Paulson, who's a longtime observer and a friend of Kemble's, had noted in our meeting. And Kemble was among the most dedicated observers, like I said, and his personality combined with his listserv activities. He was on a lot of these listservers that existed in the 1990s. And when I became interested in astronomy, he was very active on these listservers. I wasn't. I was still just a green, brand new astronomer, but I would read his posts, and I know lots of other people would as well. And he really drew observers to him just with the way that he wrote and the way that he spoke, and how he communicated with people from across Canada like myself, and people from around the world. He had friends in Sweden and Norway and other countries such as that. But in the Deep Sky magazine in the fall of 1987, Kemble published a list of his favorite 32 deep sky objects over 25 fields. And he drew from a larger project to observe all the objects within his reach, which was an 11-inch Smith-Cassegrain telescope. And that was in the circumpolar northern sky from declination positive 50 degrees north. So he was observing here in Canada, and he focused his project to try to see every single thing north of 50 degrees latitude in the nighttime sky. And I'll go on. When we think of Canadian observing, our thoughts turn to tough, cold winter nights, short, buggy summer twilight, and the aurora borealis, of course. But few projects exist dedicated to the Northern Canadian observer. Lucien Kemble was immortalized in his stream of stars we all know as Kemble's Cascade. However, he was a consummate observer. And in 1987, he pulled together a sampling from his most cherished objects to share with observers in the North. In his notes, Kemble remarked that his first binocular view of the Orion Nebula and M31 in 1962 remained with him and sparked a curiosity in deep sky observing and a desire to see nebula, star clusters, and galaxies for himself. He started using a 5-inch Celestron Schmidt-Cassegrain telescope, or an SCT, as we call them, in the early 1970s before moving on to larger and larger Schmidt-Cassegrains. Kemble writes, I began to sketch a few deep sky objects with my first telescope, a Celestron 5. Then I purchased an 8-inch telescope and began systematically sketching all the objects in the Messier catalog. The experience was so enriching, I began to look for other lists. My good friends Brenda and Bob Branchett put me onto their newly compiled and published list of the 400 best Herschel objects. I completed this project by October 1981 and gained precious experience and skill in observing and drawing. So during the 1980s, Kemble transitioned to his 11-inch Smith-Cassegrain telescope, and he sketched the objects in Norton's Sky Atlas, the Observer's Handbook, and many more from lists appearing in magazines and books like Astronomy, Sky and Telescope, Deep Sky Magazine. It was around this time that he realized that apart from the messy objects, the circumpolar sky had been sorely neglected because it was easy to ignore the ever-present objects circling Polaris in favor of the more alluring targets to the south. As Kemble put it, pass up and down so swiftly. So, those objects in the south, they come up, they sort of flirt with that southern horizon, and then they disappear, to the southwest. And it's really something that draws us all. I was looking through other observers' notes like David Levy's Deep Sky Gems, and you can see there's few objects that are north of 50 degrees latitude. To rectify this, Kemble said, I set out to observe and draw all the deep sky objects within my telescope limit from an arbitrary declination of positive 50 degrees north to the celestial pole. His list included all objects 13th magnitude and brighter, plus a selection of over 100 objects to magnitude 15.5, for a total of about 600 deep sky objects. He was only partway through his observations when the article was published, and Kemble would go on to make thousands of additional deep sky sketches in his logbooks and observe virtually every object within reach of his instruments from Lumsden, Saskatchewan, and Cochrane, Alberta. However, in reading his observations, one gets the sense that it was never about finishing the project. The discoveries you make and the people you meet along the way. I mean, you really do get that sense when you read what he wrote, don't you, Shane?
Yeah, for sure. And what I love about his comments around ignoring the circumpolar objects is 100% applicable to me. I've said that before in the podcast, that there are times like when you wrote, you had in the Rask Observer's Handbook, you had a focus on Cassiopeia. And it was fascinating to me because, I've never spent a lot of time in that constellation simply because it's always there. So I can always observe it. And that means my approach typically has been when I'm out in a dark, especially at a dark site, I'm looking south or east at, new objects that are coming up or objects that are, in a prime location, because, at some point I won't be able to see them. And in the back of my mind, I'm always saying, oh, I can look at Ursa Major tomorrow night, or I can look at Cassiopeia tomorrow night. And I just never do. So it's super cool that, Kemble sort of embraced this, that he really should explore that part of the sky and observe everything he possibly could.
Yeah, sounds good. So I'll give you another Kemble quote that will mesh nicely with this. So to quote Kemble, I would like to present my plot of all these objects and a sample list of my favorite objects, most of which are within reach of an 8-inch telescope in a dark sky. Such a program is a challenge and a test of your observing skills that yields unexpected, pleasant surprises, some frustration, and plenty of insight into the universe. A project like 50 to the Pole requires more than casual roaming among the bright sky objects. When you plot deep sky objects, you can see some interesting things. I just really like how he put that.
Yeah, that's super cool.
Yeah, I mean, it's just amazing. Like the fact that Kemble observed objects approaching 16th magnitude with an 11-inch telescope is a remarkable achievement, demonstrating the need for an observing plan and monk-like patience at the eyepiece. His work and detailed notes demonstrate what is possible, the reward of taking on a challenge, and what you can see if you stop and look around on your way to the pole. And he kind of concludes, well, this is how he concludes the article. He puts, I hope these objects give you many hours of interesting observing. It's just super, super cool, like super cool project. I think just a different way of looking at the sky.
Yeah, it's very unique. And like he said, he was addressing something that didn't exist, and from where he was living, that's a big gap. So I think it's great for Canadians for sure, and anybody else north of 50.
And so when I read through many of his notes, and I kind of put the list here. Won't go through all of it, but maybe we can talk about a little sampling of these. So I thought when you read the article, you think, oh, 8-inch telescope. Well, this is going to be an easy list. And then you look at the list and you go, holy cow, man, this guy's nuts.
Yeah, like this is super, like I would say half of it is like, well, that then it gets into like how diffuse some of these objects are, but
Yeah.
some of these magnitudes are not too bad, from like 6.8, or there's a 5.7. So there's a smattering of single digit ones like that. And then
Yeah.
there's some 10s and 11s that, still aren't too bad. But then it's like, no, there's a bunch of 14s and 15s. And that's getting pretty challenging for an 8-inch.
Yeah. Yeah. I think half the list is super tough to say the least.
Agreed.
And he did observe them all. He had an interesting observing style. So he really used his setting circles a lot. It sounds like, and he even mentions this in that article. He mentions it in some of his other correspondence with people. And that was actually one of the things that I actually knew about Kemble just from what I had read. So if that's incorrect, somebody who knows more about him or maybe corresponded with him can correct me. But I remember from what I had read in the 90s, before he passed away, is that he was very much like somebody who did use the setting circles quite frequently, although he did know this guy. Like he talks about when he was observing NGC 2602, 2603, and 2606, that he dialed it in with the setting circles and then sort of sat there with the eyepiece until he was able to see the object. So that's kind of how he was observing.
Yeah, and setting circles, whether you use manual or digital, the nice thing with that, assuming everything's calibrated, is it sort of guarantees you have the right field. And when you're looking for some of these faint objects, that's a huge part of the process and can be, probably a huge part of why you might fail if you don't have the right star field. And when you're star hopping for real faint objects, sometimes you're not going to end up in the right place. So the setting circles just help like really guarantee that.
Yeah. So some of the stuff that he observed or that he sort of included on his list are things like you can go and look at other people who make northern lists. I was doing that, and pretty much everybody puts like NGC 188, which is an open cluster, which is really near Polaris. And although it's like a 10th magnitude cluster, it's easily visible in small telescopes. And then typically, like IC 342, which is a galaxy up in Camelopardalis, which is, sort of sitting in behind some of the Milky Way stars, is also typically on those lists because it's a big flat galaxy. And at 9th magnitude, you can see it in good size, like 70 millimeter binoculars and larger instruments. And it's one of those strange objects that is easy to see at low power. And of course, he mentioned NGC 1502 being at the end of a chain of stars. But what he neglected to include in the list, of course, was his own Kemble's Cascade leading. He didn't sort of call it by name. It's kind of funny that way.
Yeah, maybe just modesty. Who knows?
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, maybe. Yeah, I kind of had wished that he had put that in there. And then as well, like he has a couple other asterisms that are in the northern sky that aren't that would have met the criteria of being 50 degrees north and towards the pole. So then it goes on into just all these faint galaxies. Named a few of them, but man, this is. And I went through and I read his observing reports on these, and I thought it was interesting. One of the things you and I were chatting about before we recorded, Shane, is that when you just read somebody's observing notes, sometimes it's difficult to get a handle on exactly like what they were thinking or what it was like for them, because some of these you just put, this is faint, and that was elongated faint, and I mean that was it. That's all he wrote for some of this stuff. So it's kind of interesting that these were the selections that he made. And then some of them are simply noteworthy because he was really like pushing his limits. And in a way, this list demonstrates a progression. Basically, this is a learning tool for people that really want to become good deep sky observers. And so what I mean by that is he includes some of the steps along the way. So, for example, the first 15th and 15th and a half magnitude galaxies that he was able to observe are on the list. So it's a progression from seeing galaxies of 12th and 13th magnitude into 14th, into 15th. And in fact, I went through and read as many of his observing reports as humanly possible, or maybe I went a little too far down that rabbit hole, and I found some that were even to 16th magnitude, that were marked as 16th magnitude at the time, I should say. They've since been found to be slightly brighter and into the high 15ths, but still, these are extremely faint objects. But I think what he's demonstrating here with this list is if you went through and observed all of this with like a 12-inch telescope, by the end of observing this list, you would be a pretty good observer, I think.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, it'll help with those skills to find faint objects, but tease out as much detail as you possibly can.
Yeah, it would be real. I think this would be pretty tough to do. So, but anyway, I think it's interesting. It goes on, talks about some brighter planetary nebulas like NGC 6543. I think that's the Cat's Eye Nebula up in Draco. And then we have NGC 68226, which is the blinking planetary nebula up in Cygnus. And then he has like NGC 6939, which is a beautiful open cluster. I viewed that. But what I found funny about the list is in some cases he pairs up some faint galaxies or groups of galaxies. But with 6939, he didn't put the fireworks galaxy, which is right there. So I thought it was kind of a strange list in that respect. Maybe he was just limited by space. Okay, no pun intended. It's an observing list. So anyway, but I thought it was a little bit strange that he didn't include like a few of the nearby objects. I forget which one it is, but I think it's the 5000 series of galaxies. I think some of those are beside Messier 101. And so when I was talking with Mike about maybe trying to tackle some of these, Mike said, those are the galaxies that I use to determine how like good the sky is that night. And I'm like, so there's sort of this broad usefulness among many amateurs in how some of these objects are used. But he only mentioned M101 in passing. So, really, like when you dig into this work alongside with his extensive, detailed, and lengthy notes and observations and sketches, you can kind of start to draw some conclusions. But I think it would take some work to do that.
Yeah, that would definitely take some time.
Yeah, there's some other cool things. So I've been I went through his notes and read as much as I could. I read all the ones that we have access to. There's a few that we don't. And then I started to think, well, what are some of the other interesting things that he observed, both challenging and maybe not so challenging, but that he made notes on. So you were asking, like, I think how many observations are there in the digital format that we were talking about?
There's I think there's just over 3,200. Yeah,
and then I told you I'd gone through them all, and you thought that was pretty crazy.
Yep.
But how I did it is I put them up on a screen and I zoomed in and I loaded them all into the memory of the computer so that I could just sort of flip through them all, and almost like using like a blink comparator, like how they discover asteroids in the old days. If I flipped really fast, the bright or the larger or the more interesting objects pop out, and then I would stop and kind of tap and go back to that one. And so sort of looking at the field sketch portion, and then I would do the same thing for the observations, because many of them he would just write faint, elongated, or like a very brief description. And then if you wrote all kinds of stuff, then that would pop out pretty quick. And so then that's what I did to kind of hone down sort of a smaller list here of some interesting stuff that he was observing, because basically much of the stuff that he was looking at was like 13th magnitude galaxies or fainter. And I think that's just so tough.
Yeah, that's not easy. You definitely need some aperture and a good dark sky.
Yeah. So when he was observing Kemble's cascade, and when he was doing some of his other observations, he would write Sky and Telescope magazine, and anybody that has access to the archives can take a look at that stuff. But one of the objects that he mentioned in his Kemble's cascade letter to Walter Scott Houston, and was published in December 1980, was Stock 23, which is Pasimo's cluster. And this is a beautiful open cluster, and it wasn't plotted on the charts at that time. So he wrote this, and this was published in Sky and Telescope. He put also in the same area, Kemble ran across the uncharted cluster known as Stock 23, omitted from star charts and observing guides. This little cluster is surprisingly conspicuous in amateur telescopes. It is about 10 arc minutes in diameter and has a total magnitude of about 6.5. And then he put several years ago, New York amateur John Pasimo also happened upon this cluster. His reports appear in Sky and Telescope magazine in March of 1978. And then Houston goes on to talk about Kemble's explanation for how he would do his sketches, which is pretty cool. So he says Kemble used a trick for making drawings at the telescope that I've not heard of before. He racks the eyepiece out of focus until only the brightest stars are visible, and then plots their relative positions. Once this skeleton is made, he refocuses and adds the fainter stars. So that's how he actually did the sketches. So it's kind of cool because that's not mentioned anywhere in the sketching work. So I'm not sure what you think about that, Shane.
No, that's very interesting.
Now, he did observe like a lot of different groups of objects. And one of the things that he did, and if you go through Cloudy Nights, you can see this as well, because this is well known, again, because he communicated with so many different observers, that these things are still being talked about. It's kind of amazing to think that he was, sort of quote unquote, just an amateur astronomer. And he's still talked about to this day. If you look up what size telescope do you need to see all the Palomar globular clusters with, you'll see all kinds of posts around saying, oh, well, Kemble said, and it's amazing. Like people are quoting him as like general knowledge in the amateur community here decades after his death. And that, I think, is a real tribute to the impact that he made on the community. So, for example, he saw all the Palomar clusters with his 11-inch telescope. We have the observations. We know this. He was publishing those online as well. So everybody knew that Kemble had seen these with an 11-inch. And there is one that is north of 50, which is Palomar 1, which is a soft glow suspected using averted vision, according to Kemble. That's what he wrote in his notes. So it's really interesting to think about the fact that he was able to see that. So, now I'm like, well, with Mike's telescope, I really want to go and try to knock that one out. I think that one would be pretty interesting.
Yeah, no kidding. That is interesting.
So these Palomar globulars were only found, I think, in the 50s or 60s or something like that. So they're pretty tough. I've seen a few of them before. I think like Palomar 11 and Palomar 12, and I've seen the three brightest ones. I think there's three that are brighter than 12th magnitude or something, and I've hunted those ones down. So, but yeah, they're very beautiful and tough going. Some of the other things that could be worth looking at are like NGC 896, which is part, I think it's like the heart or the soul. It's one or the other. It's part of that nebula complex. And he mentioned that and did a sketch of it. And he mentioned that frequently in his notes. And then this one's really interesting because it's mentioned in his observing notes, but I couldn't figure out what it was. And it's called Ling 1, which is an object that Alistair Ling had run across. And Alistair Ling is a columnist for Astronomy Magazine. I think I mentioned him earlier. And I know Alistair a little bit because we were sitting on the RASC National Committee when that existed as reps for our various centers. And I knew who he was, of course. Like he walked in the room and I'm like, that's Alistair. I know who he is. I have to go and talk to him. And I doubt he would remember it. But I went up and I was like, I really enjoy reading your stuff. I remember, I'm sure he was like, who is this loser? Or something, right? But anyway, I was like, really, it's really cool though. Like when you're in these amateur circles, you can actually like meet these people and whatever. So anyway, the odd time I would, run into him at different things. He's like an extremely nice person and has always been very gracious. And so I actually was asking him about Ling 1. And so he sent me his observing notes on it yesterday, and so now I know where to plot it. It's not plotted on any of the charts or anything, but it is at 60.2, and anyway, it's just southwest of stock 20. I think is where it is. And so I was like, there's nothing plotted there on any of my charts. And I have a lot of charts, as you know, anybody who's listening knows that I collect star charts. And so what I did is I looked it up in my software. My software is really good. Isophotes. Do you know what isophotes are? The photes?
Sorry, ISO what?
Isophotes. Anyway,
no.
These are the contours of the Milky Way. So what they do when they're making, like, when you open up a star chart and you see like that beautiful flow of like the Milky Way and sort of like this blue and some areas are darker and lighter and blah, 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 or rifts or whatever, like that sort of thing that you see sort of spanning many pages of your star charts.
Yeah.
These are the isophotes. And my understanding is what they do is they're taking an aggregate of the data and they're applying that in certain ways. And I don't know how they do it exactly. And then they plot that now using computers into the charts of the softwares that you're using. And so what I did is I knew now exactly where this was. I took a screenshot, and then you could vaguely see, and it could have just been like a smudge on my computer or something, but you could vaguely see that where Alistair had indicated there was some of these isophotes there. And so I pumped up the contrast and played with the brightness and that. And then I actually put the pointer on and sent it back to him. Like, it showed up in the isophotes. So definitely it's a real something. Alistair was saying it's probably like an asterism. And, I was thinking, oh, maybe it's like a star cloud or something, but he's saying, it's an asterism. And now I gotta go take a look at this. Looks like I'm so excited to go and observe this once it clears off.
That's awesome.
Yeah. Some of the other stuff that Kemble observed, many times was some of the objects in and around Cedar Bland 14. So this stuff is, I think what many people would determine is very obscure. But it also happens to be a lot of the stuff that I observed too. Sorry, what's that, Shane?
I just said, okay. Yeah.
Yeah. I've observed Cedar Bland 14. So Cedar Bland 14 is near NGC 7822. These are two huge nebular complexes, which are very far north. They're probably the largest, brightest nebulas in the northern sky. I think that's probably the best way to put it. Cedar Bland 14, I think, is brighter than the NGC portion, which I find a little bit strange. But anyway, he was observing all sort of the clusters in and around them and many times and that sort of thing. So I thought that was pretty cool. And then some of the other stuff he observed was like the dwarf galaxies that are up there. And he observed a dwarf galaxy in Draco, which is amazing because I tried to find other people who had observed it. And I think only like Mel Bartels and maybe a couple other people had sketches of this online. So these are things that weren't greatly observed. He observed the Ursa Minor dwarf. He observed the Leo 1 dwarf galaxies. He observed some quasars that are up there. He observed a lot of UGC galaxies, which you think of as being like so faint. I think the only other person I know who's been observing these that like sort of in our circle is Mark Bratton with his 18 and 22 inch telescopes. And holy cow, like those you think of as tough, but some of them don't look too bad. So I'm like, holy cow, I got to go take a look at some of these because they don't look like they're too bad. Maybe I can get them in my 5-inch. And I thought I'd never see a UGC galaxy in my 5-inch. And now I think, maybe I'll be able to do that. Anyway, there's a lot of other different things that he was looking at. One of them is a really big cluster called Colander 471, which is a huge cluster, part of the Cepheus OB1 Association. He said that one's very large. It's a bright open cluster and part of that Cepheus OB1 Association. So, and I have been trying to observe a lot of these myself. and it's marked in the charts and that, but I just hadn't, for whatever reason, it hadn't caught my attention before. So it was really cool to go through his notes. And I'm like, I kind of went through thinking I'm just going to find the objects that he put in that article, and then, kind of see, what of those I can see. But then as I was trying to locate those, as you know, it's not organized at all. So you have to kind of look at everything if you're going to try to find things. And then I was finding this other stuff and then sort of putting it in a separate file folder. And then last night I kind of went back to it. I'm like, there's some stuff here that I want to go and take a look at now that I otherwise would have missed. So Kemble is probably going to guide my observing for the summer, sort of strangely enough, 23 years after his passing or so.
Yeah. Well, like you said, like some of the objects that he was into is not like, they're just not all, like not all of these are common and not part of common catalogs. So it's easy to not be aware of them or even overlook them in some cases.
Yeah, and like I said, the one thing that I did have a bit of concern over was the fact that for whatever reason, none of his planetary nebula observations survive, and that's unfortunate. So I had written Alistair again, like, I'm really appreciative, and what a nice person to really spend some time and care and attention, as Alistair did over the past few days, as he's always done in the past when I've ever reached out to him. And he actually wrote back with like a really key piece of correspondence. And he wrote back and said that he had a letter there, and he quoted the bit from the note that said that Kemble was at that time, whenever it was written, which was around the time of this article, I think, waiting for the Webb Society Observer's Handbook on the planet that contained the planetary nebula, and that Kemble had said there's 146 planetary nebula in that text, and he had observed, I think it was 140 out of the 146, and probably the 6 that he didn't observe were just below the horizon here. So I have that book. So then I'm like, I got to get that book, and I couldn't find it. I'm like, where's that book? And I scoured the whole house, and it was pushed back, and my bookshelf is deep, and it just was pushed back. I have the volumes 1 through 7 or 8 or whatever they are from the Webb Society from, they published those in the 70s. But I bought them when a telescope company was going out of business, and I happened to be driving by, and they had them all, and I bought them for like $15 or something. Anyway, so I grabbed it, and I'm like, I know that he observed everything in this. And I mean, he observed for years after that email was written. So likely he did observe maybe them all, or if he didn't, then they would just be the ones below the horizon. So I kind of feel like, okay, well, like that there in hand is at least 140 planetary nebulas that we know that he observed now. Right? So right there, if somebody has that, or they want to, spend the lavish amount of $4.95, which is the going used price for one of those books, you two can have a compendium of all the planetaries. But he observed all kinds of different things. Like most of the King clusters up in Cassiopeia, a lot of the Berkeley clusters, a lot of the Zernich clusters. And more and more just one-off objects, and people's own observations that like Alistair's observation of Ling 1, which isn't charted, and he had gone and observed that. Different things of that nature. Just really, really inspiring to kind of see all that. So I hope this podcast made sense. I'm not sure.
Well, I'm interested.
Okay.
The observer that Kemble was is fascinating in and of itself. The fact that, again, we have such a close proximity to his work is super cool to me. And then when you layer on just that he was into some really different projects, at least at the time, or again, unique objects, that's fascinating. And then the fact that a lot of this stuff, well, I shouldn't say a lot, but a significant portion is challenging. And as he stated, if you observe this will make you a better observer. And I think that that's a neat thing to work towards too.
Well, I like the way you put that, Shane. I'm not sure if you have anything else to add to this episode.
I just want to share one quick observing log from Kemble.
Okay.
So it's from the article 50 to the Pole in the Deep Sky magazine edition from fall 1987. And any northern observer will probably relate to this, which is why I think it's kind of special, or at least why I like it. So the observing log is for NGC 2320 as well as 2322. I spotted NGC 2320 easily in spite of an interference from a bright auroral band. so that's the part that I think a lot of northern observers can relate to.
Yeah.
And then he just goes on to say that there is a strange difference in the old and new descriptions in the RNGC for NGC 2320. The old description states that an eighth magnitude star lies to the southwest, but the new description states, and then in brackets more correctly, that a bright star lies 1 arc minute to the northeast. NGC 2322 is faint and lies to the southeast in the same low power field. So I love the reference to the aurora, and I also love the, kind of calling out that there's some errors sometimes in, the numbers or magnitudes of objects, or even the position of objects. So sometimes if you see something that seems not right and you're confident in the star field, it might just be because of an error in a catalog. And those are not uncommon. That happens all the time.
Yeah, and that's one thing that from what I understand, people like Kemble and other folks were trying to sort out at the time is some of the errors and omissions which had been carried forward into the NGC and the IC and the other object indices and catalogs. So they were really trying to work through that. So even though we often think of the early observers like Carolyn Herschel and William Herschel and Swift and Barnard and all these different folks, and then Dreyer kind of working together to sort of bring these all together into these catalogs. I think one of the things which has occurred sort of in the more recent past is a lot of amateur groups. I know there was the NGC IC project, which has gone a little bit defunct now, but there's been some spin-offs from that, and we have all these sort of observing notes from people. And then people like Wolfgang Steinecke have gone forward and created his text. The name escapes me at the moment, but it's on the observing history of the NGC. You can just look up Wolfgang Steinecke and NGC book. And I have his book here, actually, right here on the Herschels. And a lot of the rectified positional work is in there. And even in the RNGC, there was a lot of errors. And so they were able to help rectify those errors, omissions, and mistakes. There is, and I should point this out. So, because I kind of, in a way, don't want people trying to go digging these articles. Can be difficult to find. You just happen to have Kemble's actual physical copy, which is super cool. Mm-hmm. But in going through that and going through the list, I went through the list in detail. And there are some challenges to the positions and the object types and some of the other things in this list. So one thing that I've been working through, and we hope to publish this probably next year, is to go through and actually do the rectification for this list. And so that's going to require a few different stages, which I've done the first stage, which is to actually grab the updated details. And then there's the observational stage, actually go out and to take a look at these objects. So I've been chatting with Mike on maybe how we would do that. Might need to find some other observers as well. Certainly if somebody is interested out there and doing it and has some pretty significant experience doing this type of work, this is pretty specialized work. I'd enjoy hearing from them. Maybe somebody with an 18-inch telescope or something like that would be very helpful. So anyway, I think Bill Weir's been making some of the observations too. In fact, I know he has. So that's kind of where we're at with this right now, and hope to do some observing. Using some of Kemble's logs this summer. Shane.
Yeah, I think that's super exciting. I'm looking forward to seeing some of these objects.
All right. Well, thanks, Shane. Thanks, everybody, for listening. Please like and subscribe. That really helps the algorithms. And we're always excited to get your observing reports to actualastronomy@gmail.com. Thanks again.
Thank you, everyone, for listening, and we hope you enjoyed the show. If you are interested in more information, would like to contact us, or if you would like to support the podcast, check out our website, actualastronomy.com.